I want to tell you a story about a haunting out in Volo. I didn't really believe it until I went out there and experienced it for myself. Now, it's believed that a Civil War soldier named Wallace Gale haunts the grounds. But there have been other apparitions of a young woman and a female child that have been seen inside that Volo antique barn. So I went and we visited the Volo Auto Museum, and when I was done, I went to the barn just to see what was in there, and they had a lot of interesting old things for sale. But when I went into the portion of the mall that was the old barn from the 1800s, everything was about to change. I immediately walked through some kind of a thick air that was cold, and I didn't know what it was. When I entered that third part, or that fourth part of the antique mall, the original barn, I didn't feel alone. I felt as if I was being watched. When the salesperson and another person inside that area left, I began to smell a burning odor that smelled like tobacco, but with a sweet flavor to it. And I didn't know where it was coming from. And in one of the pictures I'm posting, you can see an arrow, and that is where this shadow man was said to have been sighted. It was very hard for me to continue walking down there, and especially in this one part that was an aisle that led to a door with a stained glass window. When the salesperson had come back, I talked to him a little bit further, and he had mentioned that that door at one point opened by itself and the alarm came off when a ghost investigator was inside, and they don't know why. So I started to snap some pictures, particularly of two pictures of servicemen from World War II. And I kind of felt bad that those pictures didn't pass down the family line as they should have, but I wasn't quite sure who this ghost was that they were talking about, but I felt like those pictures had something to do with it. When I got home and I took a good look at things, I saw in some of my pictures a reflection of a man in the glass of one of those pictures above my reflection. And I looked closer, and it looked like a young man. And there was nothing in that aisle that would have looked like that reflected on that glass. So now my interest was piqued, and I began to do a lot of research. I found out the history of the land and the history of a family called the Gales, who came out with several of their cousins, as well as some other families. I also found out that there were a total of 9 Civil War soldiers that were buried or recognized in the Volo Cemetery across the street. The soldier that they thought was haunting the old barn had grown up on the property with his family. His name was Wallace Gale. The H, I found out later, stood for Henry Wallace Gale. Henry Wallace Gale had enlisted in the Army, 92nd Illinois U.S. Infantry, Company D, when he was 20 years old, and when the town was named Forksville, Illinois, rather than Volo, Illinois. He was 5'9", had light hair, blue eyes, a fair complexion. He was single, and he was a teacher. I found this out through the Illinois State Archives. Unfortunately, Henry died several months later from typhoid fever in a hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. And he was buried in Nashville, Tennessee a few months before his 21st birthday. He died in February of 1863. Later that year, his brother John W. Gale was drafted for the war, because up until that time, men were volunteering, but they didn't have enough men, so they began a draft. Well, this didn't sit well, because rich men were able to pay $300 to another person to get out of the draft, and so the men rioted. And there were provisions put in place to allow getting out of the draft, and one of them included caring for infirmed elderly parents, which would have been John W. Gale's situation. He was the only son left to take care of his elderly parents on the farm, and he was about 2 years older than Henry. So he did not go to war. There's no evidence that he went. There were other John Gales in the nearby town of Wakanda and another Illinois town who went, but this was not the same John W. Gale who was the brother of the supposed ghost of Volo. John W. Gale stayed home. He got married. He had 2 children. He stayed and inherited the farm. His son inherited the farm later, and in around 1915 it appears that the property was sold. And it appears that it passed through several hands until the Grahams family purchased it in the 1960s, of which the Grahams family still owns the property in the area. Now, as I said, there were 9 Civil War soldiers that came from that area. 4 of them died in war. One of them came back and died shortly afterwards from some infirmity that he had acquired during the war, which is probably an illness. And 4 of them made it back and lived a long life. Most of the people in the Volo cemetery across the street from the antique barn were related. They were either family members or related through marriage or just simply neighbors, close-knit neighbors. Eliza Graves died in a hospital in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. D. Burr Ackley was killed in the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia. Nelson Houston died in a hospital in Columbia, Tennessee. And as I mentioned, Henry Wallace Gale died of typhoid fever in a hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. None of those men's bodies made it home. They were buried in military cemeteries, and cenotaphs were put up in their honor in the Volo Cemetery. Now, Lewis Weatherly made it home, but it didn't seem to last long. A few years later, he ended up dying. The other 4 men made it home. John and Robert Walton made it home. Andrew Jackson Raymond made it home. And one other gentleman named Emilius Ames made it home. And those 4 soldiers were able to live a long life and have families. So, doing the research that I did, as I said, I found out that Henry Wallace Gale was a teacher before he went to war. So he had a career, and there was a small schoolhouse not far from his house that he taught at, apparently. And as I said, that farm was held in the family for 4 or 5 generations until it had to be sold. So why is Henry Wallace Gale and other possible members of his family haunting the Volo Antique Mall and other parts of that area? Well, my thought is he died too young. He didn't want to die that young. He wanted to come back and have a family, and he was unable to do so. So he's attached to the land and probably enjoying it further with whatever family members remain with him. Now, he had some second cousins, the Ida Gale, two Idas. One was 20 years old, and one was 5 years old when they died. And I would bet that those are the female apparitions that have been seen in that barn. So I compiled quite a bit of information about the area and the people. And it's also quite possible they were involved in the Underground Railroad. I did find what I believe is a 3rd cousin up in Wisconsin. He ended up becoming a judge. He was a Gale as well. He created the town of Galesville, Wisconsin. And he created a school up there, Gale College, which is no longer around, but lasted quite a while. But he was involved in several things up there. And there was another Gale in Galesburg, Illinois, who was involved in the Underground Railroad and creating Knox College. So this family was quite involved in the abolitionist movement, education, and the Underground Railroad, and they were spread out quite a bit through Wisconsin and Illinois after they came from Vermont and Massachusetts and New York. So if you'd like to read more, there's a book that I wrote, and like I said, I've compiled quite a bit of the information. It's rather interesting, and I had come back several times to that Volo antique barn to photograph. The second time I photographed orbs. The third, fourth, and fifth time I felt a cold spot with a slight odor of tobacco. And the last time I came back, I put a box out there with a book and some items for Henry Wallace Gale and some flowers for everybody in the cemetery just to say thank you and remember them. So if you're ever out there and you feel something strange or see something strange, it may be the Gales. Thank you. All right, I'm here. It's November 19th, it's Saturday. I left the box with my book and some information about Henry Wallace Gale and a little reward for being best teacher since he was a teacher. And I hope it's left here and people don't take it. And I just put some flowers down for everybody else at the Volo Cemetery. So I gotta go because it's pretty cold today and I gotta go warm up. But just remembering, thank you.